Just gonna kind of we're getting our intro slides ready and now we're officially recording. But thank you all. Welcome to the September Hawaii Public Health Training Hui webinar. FASD, which is Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder, is a Kākau thing. My name is Makamai Namahoe. I will serve as your facilitator for today's training. Before we get started, want to go over some Zoom housekeeping rules. Next slide, please. Want to thank the organizers of this training, myself, Melia, who is also in the background, as well as the Hawaii Public Health Training Hui steering committee members. Next slide. Want to thank our sponsors and partners for providing CEs for today, which includes the NASW Hawaii chapter, the Training Hui. Next slide. As well as the Western Region Public Health Training Center, along with the Public Health Learning Network. Next slide, please. For today's training, CEs that have been approved and provided are for certified health education specialists, registered dietitians, licensed social workers, as well as nursing medical. Oh, sorry, next slide. Yep, nursing medical, as well as substance abuse and prevention specialists. Sweet, thank you. Next slide, please. Today's training will run for an hour and a half, and we have been approved for 1.5 credit hours. For those, if you are seeking to receive CE credits from today's training, please complete the survey that will follow today's webinar. It is included in the Mahalo email. Melia will be emailing everybody who attends today's training with the email address that you used to register today. So please keep an eye out for that email. If you are joining by phone, please send Melia an email. Her name is melia@hifi.org and include your name and phone number that you used today so we can ensure that you receive a Mahalo email. For those who complete, we ask that you complete those the survey no later than next week, Wednesday, October 1st. Shortly after that, we will send out your certificates by October 10th. If you do not receive your certificate by then, please email Amelia at hifi.org for any missing certificates. Sometimes some organizations do enable their firewall or their firewalls do block outside emails. So if possible, please reach out with a personal email address instead. Next slide, please. Quick Zoom housekeeping. All participants that are joining us today, you are muted upon entry when your cameras are off. For all questions that you have for our presenter, please utilize the chat box or the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. This meeting is being recorded and will be shared on the Hawaii Public Health Training Hui's YouTube channel. And you will also receive the link of the recording in your Mahalo email along with the slides from today. Next slide, please. All right, it is my honor to introduce the queen, the guest speaker herself, Mana Lune. She is the current executive director of Hawaii FASD Action Group and specializes clinically in maternal and infant health and perinatal and substance abuse disorders. Born and raised in Hawaii, she is a consultant, advocate, and public health researcher and has worked for more than 25 years in support of children, adults, and families in complex issues such as severe mental illness, systemic and historical trauma, and social justice for the health of communities. I would like to hand it over to Amanda. Thank you so much.
What a lovely introduction. It makes me feel fancy. Is my sound okay? Can everybody hear me all right? Is there any way that I can get feedback on that?
Yep.
It's good.
You sound good. Yes. Folks are saying
Thank
yes in the
you.
chat.
Thank
Awesome.
you, folks. I'm a very feedbacky person. I'm going to ask questions into the ether sphere where I can't see any of you. I admit I'm super excited because I'm looking at the attendees and I don't know most of you. And I think that that is really cool because I have spent a lot of time in the community and I know a lot of people, and I think it's really awesome that I don't know most of you. If I am correct, there are a couple, however, of my Aim High fellows in here, and you're making me feel safe. I see a few of you, and I just want to aloha you and say hello. There is, a small community sometimes in terms of work specifically in some of the harder things in maternal and infant health. And so it's really important that we know and love on each other. I'm gonna go ahead and try to do my screen share thing. I'm not always the best at this, so give me a minute and make it so that I can have it in my lovely little presentation mode. You guys don't see all my notes and all my thingies, and I can actually kind of move everything forward. Okay, how are we looking? Does it look like I
Looks
did that
good.
right?
Yes, you
Okay,
did.
so you only see my fanciness and none of my mess, right?
You sure do. Well, this
Uh,
is fancy too, but this is all goods. Yeah, you're good to go, Amanda.
Thank you so much. All right, well, hi friends, and thank you for that intro, Amaka. I appreciate it. I've been doing this stuff for a long time, and I'll get right into it because I feel like that intro was really great. I have a pretty extensive background on a lot of different things, so I hope that we can connect in one way, shape, or form. Today we're going to learn about some stuff that you may or may not know about. We'll talk a little bit more about specifically sort of the heaviness of the content, but we're going to look at prenatal alcohol exposure. We're going to talk about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, FASDs. We're going to look at what that might look like in relationship to an individual's behavior presentation, and then also how that connects to our systemic responses and what we're doing here in Hawaii in relationship to what that means in our systems of care and the way that we understand the complexity around screening and assessment diagnosis and what FASD-informed care could and might look like in Hawaii. So I have a confession to make before I get going. Um, when I put this presentation together and we were starting to develop this partnership with the public health folks, we were in the process of working on some really complex legislation called the FASD Respect Act with our national affiliates. So I was actually in DC last week for Impact Week, and that piece of legislation passed 2 days after the Hawaii contingent was there. So I'm just gonna we'll take a little bit of pretend credit on that because we've been working on that for 5 years, and that actually opens up the door for some significant opportunities in relationship to federal matching funds to states and what we're doing here in Hawaii. And so I am scrambled eggs in my brain in terms of some of these things that I might change my slides a little bit and I might add some things here and there. But that was a really significant thing that happened very, very recently. And I've not had an opportunity to update a few things. So I'll kind of throw that in. That's just like a heads up for you guys. The Action Group is for a very long time, was an all-volunteer nonprofit. I have been the staff for about a year, a little bit more than a year. I am the only staff. And so I'm going to say we a lot, but what I mostly mean is me. I have a part-time contracted assistant who you may get some emails from someday. And I have several contractors who are great trainers and great volunteers in relationship to our board and our advocates. But I am currently the only full-time staff with the Action Group. So we primarily work in public awareness. So public awareness, education, advocacy, and we do some research. And so when you're thinking about what it is that who we are, I want you to kind of frame us from that standpoint, because at this time, we have a very tiny bit of money and we only have one staff person. And so we are primarily a public education and awareness advocacy group. I like to give people a little bit of a warning. The reason I give people a warning is because we're going to talk about some things that I think is kind of foreign to a lot of folks and maybe new information. And so what I'm going to present might leave you feeling a little uncomfortable. You might get a little overwhelmed. I'm going to probably leave you at this point with more questions than answers. And so I want everybody to get in your space, take your deep breaths wherever you're at. I know I can't see you. I'm sure you're all taking care of whatever you need to take care of. Take care of your biology, take care of your physiology. But get ready to explore some hard stuff. And I like to give that premise because I think it's important to be prepared to receive this information, because if you're not mentally prepared, it can kind of not get it in the way that we hope to integrate it further into our work. So we are part of a community of helpers. We are a multidisciplinary group. We all have some connection in some way. And when we say FASD is a Kākau thing, we're going to get into that further. It's because this touches every single part of our society and all of our systems in ways that we very often don't even think about. So we are going to, as a collective, commit to that benefit of the doubt, thinking that everyone is doing the best that they can, and that when we know better, we do better. And that's the nature of iterative learning and growing, and that we evolve in our profession, our work, our careers, and that we commit to, as we get new information, we synthesize and we integrate it into the way that we practice. So let's get into it. Do we have any questions at this point? I'll take a pause if there's anything in the chat right now, if anybody wants to let me know before we start getting specifically into what FASDs are. No need? Okay, Paul? All right. Gotcha, Maka. So fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. A lot of folks are familiar with FAS. So that's fetal alcohol syndrome. But the spectrum of conditions, when you think about alcohol use in pregnancy, you got 9 months, almost 10, 40 weeks. And then you got any number of dose or duration of alcohol exposure. So you could have a little bit in the beginning, maybe don't know you're pregnant. You could have a substance use disorder with use throughout the pregnancy. There could be an instance of stressful binge drinking in a later part of pregnancy. However, that happens for whatever reason. FASDs are a spectrum of conditions because dose and duration of alcohol is different for every single person of the alcohol exposure. So when we talk about FASDs, we need to remember their spectrum of conditions. So they could lead to any number of things, including physiological effects, because it's a whole body effect. So we see a lot of heart defects, we see visual and hearing impairments. But what we see most often, and we know is happening most often, are more hidden or invisible conditions. So they are lifelong neurological and neurodevelopmental conditions that look very different than what we think they are. So they can look like some sensory sensitivities. They can look like some memory issues, some other functional and social issues, communication impairments. But we'll go into those a little bit more specifically. So the diagnosable spectrum of conditions are fetal alcohol syndrome. We'll talk more about that. Partial fetal alcohol syndrome, different medical and professional organizations are going back and forth as to whether or not that's something that we should be using, or if it's always a full FAS, or we're looking at the other neurodevelopmental conditions. Alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorders, alcohol-related birth defects, and behavioral disorders associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. So there are other countries, in the United States, we like to think we're the bee's knees and we're everything, but other countries will classify FASD, the spectrum of conditions, as a diagnosis itself. In Hawaii and in the United States, we do not currently do that. So this is a kind of a general overview, and I want us to kind of hold some of this. So prenatal alcohol exposure can have immediate and long-lasting teratogenic effects. So when we say teratogenic, we're talking about changes to cellular structure. So ethanol actually changes cellular structure pretty much from zygote. So pretty much from implantation. So right away. And alcohol is pretty toxic. It causes all sorts of anomalies. It changes cellular structure, and those may look like behavioral or other types of impairments throughout the lifespan. And again, not curable, because we're talking about essentially congenital, where you're born with the structure that is a result of the exposure, and that's how you are for your lifespan. So I have this recent national studies, but there's actually more recent national studies that indicate we're looking at closer to 7% of the general population affected. So to put that into perspective, autism right now is about 3%. All of the other developmental disabilities or congenital conditions hover between 1 and 2. And so FASDs are actually more common than all of the other developmental disabilities and congenital conditions combined. And so when we think about our systems of care, we kind of need to remember it's a lot more prevalent than we think that it is. So because of this complexity, like the spectrum of conditions, the fact that it's invisible, it's a little bit hard to diagnose, and the fact that it's a hard thing to talk about, because it's really tough for us sometimes to make it safe to get information about prenatal alcohol use. There's a lot of shame and stigma that goes along with that in terms of misunderstanding why someone may or may not drink during a pregnancy. It means that we're going to have folks that are put into systems that are less than responsive, let's say. And here I have on the slide, it says punitive, that don't understand what's going on with them. So there's some brain-based stuff that folks were born with, but we call it other things. So we're going to get into that further. So when we're going through the whole presentation today, if you can hold on to these three things, okay? Well, technically it's four. First of all, no amount is safe. I know that's going to bring up some questions, and I hope that it does. I'm going to pause those questions till the very end, but no amount is safe, which means that from conception through delivery, exposure to ethanol through the placenta is not safe and can have the possibility of a teratogenic effect to change cellular structure throughout the entirety of the pregnancy. This has been the CDC's recommendation, the NIH's recommendation, the general consensus in the medical community for many, many years now. It does not necessarily affect cognition or intelligence. I want us to hold that because very often when we're looking for things like developmental disabilities, we're looking for things like IQ, we're looking for learning disabilities, we tend to look at intelligence, IQ, and certain tests and measures that help us understand whether or not someone has a particular cognitive capacity. And I want us to, we're going to get into that about differentiating things like impulse, memory, sensory issues, and cognition, because they are different in terms of brain function. It can be very, very challenging to understand, especially without information about maternal history. So we don't often have instances, and our community has not always made that safe for a birth mom to say, but what if I did? We say, don't drink during your pregnancy, but what if I did? For whatever reason. And again, those reasons are often very complex. And so we're not getting a lot of information from maternal history and bio moms because societally, we haven't really made it safe to talk about that. And that each person with an FASD is going to be unique, just like, you're special just like everyone else kind of situation, because of that spectrum of the time that we're in utero and the time in which dose and duration of alcohol exposure, each kind of FASD is going to look a little bit different. I'm going to take another pause there for questions. Is there anything in the chat, Maka?
There's not a question, but there was a comment raised and wanted just to elevate it to you. Someone had wrote they were pregnant during the time when some doctors informed that 3 glasses of wine weekly was fine to drink during pregnancy. Any thoughts to that, Amanda?
I have a lot of thoughts on that. And this is where it's really important for us to say, hey, this is nobody's fault. Because our medical science has evolved over time and people were getting a lot of advice that was not really accurate. And so we're going to have folks that have some exposures and we have to consider what that might mean for them. And we have to do that in a way that is not shaming and is acknowledging that societally we're all evolving about our understanding of alcohol and its effects on fetal development, on our own development, right? Like on human beings generally, we're evolving our understanding of what moderation is and dose and duration. And so what I would say is that if there is any sense that maybe there was some alcohol use during the pregnancy, and there's some concerns about some neurodevelopmental behaviors in the person that was, in utero during that pregnancy, that we might want to check in with some folks about considering the effects of the prenatal alcohol exposure. So if folks want to check in with me, phone number where we do consult lines. But what I want to say is that is a big part of why we say FASD is a Kākau thing. This is not a one-to-one. Mom made a bad decision and so her kiddo was affected. The reality is alcohol is ubiquitous in terms of use in our community and our society and our medical science over many, many years, and our ability to safely talk about things has changed and evolved. So it is what it is in terms of what exposures, historical exposures might have been. And so we have to just be able to talk about how to best support somebody who may have had those. So I hope that that rounds it out just a little bit for that comment. And then if you want to check in with me later, please do.
Great.
So that actually leads into my perfectly into my next item, what I was going to talk about. We say we and us a lot more than they and them. When we say something like 1 in 7, 7% of the general population, or 1 in 20 folks, or it's more like 1 in 18 folks, right, might be affected. We're all going to know somebody, whether it was our own pregnancy, whether it's our cousin or our auntie or our sister or our neighbor or whatever, we're all going to know somebody, because alcohol's here and it's everywhere, here, there, and everywhere. And so rather than, again, doing that one-to-one, right, like that one mom made those decisions or did these things, we're going, that's really complicated as to how or why that exposure might have occurred. So we're going to talk about it from a standpoint that says, hey, alcohol is socially acceptable. It's legal. We use it for celebration. We use it for ceremony. We use it in all sorts of contexts. It's our social lubricant. It's how we hang out and get along. It's our pahana. We do all sorts of things with alcohol that nobody's judging anybody for. And then we get into this responsible use conversation. But then we realize that half of pregnancies are unplanned. That's what our data says in Hawaii and nationally. So we get a little bit complicated, a little bit nuanced, right? We need to understand that addiction is complicated, dependency is complicated. And so the way that we talk about how or why that exposure occurs, we're kind of going to pan out and look at that from a community-based perspective. So we have to remember it's also a Kākau thing, because FASDs are really challenging to diagnose. And the reason for that, again, is because they're a spectrum disorder. So I want us to hold, as we go through the whole presentation, what it might look like in our different scope of work and our different scopes of practice and the different places that we are. So school behavioral and learning challenges. We're gonna see the kids that maybe have the ADHD diagnosis, but their stimulant medication is not working. Or we're going to see folks that are at a greater risk. For example, if you're on a stimulant medication and you don't have a true ADHD, and in my work with my clinical work with adults, that we screened for FASDs as adults, a whole big chunk of them, and I don't have the percentage in front of me, that they were put on stimulant medications that eventually led to methamphetamine addiction, because they didn't have a true ADHD, they had an FASD, which is not going to be supported by a stimulant medication. Again, teratogenic brain damage. So we see a lot of folks that are getting in trouble. They're getting in trouble because memory is a huge, huge issue, for example. And if you don't have good short-term memory intake and you can't even recall basic instructions after a certain period of time, you're going to get in a lot of trouble, and you're going to become that one, right? That one that doesn't listen. You're going to become all those kinds of things in our systems that have expectations of behavior without any sense of brain base. We're going to see folks that are in vulnerable and unsafe situations where if you have, let's say, trouble with the part of your brain that helps you to understand cause and effect, you're going to have a hard time thinking about what the effects of your actions are, and then using your sense of cause and effect to make a decision that is safer. You may make that decision a little bit more impulsively and a little bit more in the moment, because your brain doesn't go play the tape out, look at the consequences, come back and give you that feedback loop to help you make a good decision, because you actually have damage to the part of your brain that does that for you. So let's talk a little bit about diagnosis. Fetal alcohol syndrome, and I don't think we have too many docs on here. I wish I could have kind of known where everybody was from a little bit. But if you are a doc and you are somebody who's working with docs, we're going to look a little bit at some of the sentinel facial features that we might see with a full fetal alcohol syndrome. This is maybe when mom's struggling a little bit more with alcohol. Maybe there's a dependency and addiction. There might have been exposure throughout the entire duration of the pregnancy, or there might have been large amounts of exposures that particular junctures during the pregnancy. So we're going to see that face. Historically, it's kind of been called the FASD face. We're going to see a flatter philtrum here. We're going to see the folds in the eyes look a little bit differently. And we're going to see that microcephaly, we call it often, where we have a little bit of a smaller head. And there's going to be all sorts of things that are going to come with that. But I won't get into it too much because I don't think we've got too many diagnosing docs on this training. If you are interested in more, we can get more into that. There's going to be some other central nervous system involvements, and then there's also going to be some other minor anomalies that docs who are in diagnosing or working on a diagnostic team might really want to look at in relationship to some of the known risks that might exist. And so if there are known risks, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in screenings, then you might want to look more carefully into some of the minor anomalies that might be presenting biologically. What we do know, however, is that only about 10 or 20% of kids who have the FASDs are going to be born with those biological features, with cranial features, with some of those more minor anomalies that are identifiable and easily noticeable at birth. About 80–85% of folks that are going to be born with an FASD are basically going to have no immediate visual signs or cues that indicate that they might have an FASD. There is no individual or specific screening for FASDs, and we'll talk more about what diagnostic looks like and those teams and how you get to a diagnosis. But there is no singular one screening or assessment that you might do, especially as someone gets older, to determine if someone has an FASD. So what we end up with are a lot of really invisible brain-based neurodevelopmental disorders. So a lot of folks, again, we're looking at close to 5–7% of the general population, and special populations, that's a lot higher. I'll share some of our work in Hawaii on that. We're looking at a lot of folks walking around with some brain-based stuff that they don't know anything about, that maybe their family doesn't know anything about, and that the community, the systems they're working in don't know anything about. So when we talk about brain-based disorders, I love this slide. I always mahalo Dr. Matson at UCSD for letting us use this, because it's pretty simple, but it's also really gets into some of the parts of the brain and where the behavior might be affected if those different parts of the brain had some damage. And so when we look at these parts, one may be affected and one might not. And that's important for us to understand, because when I talk about that spectrum of when the alcohol was exposed, right, when the alcohol exposure occurred, and then which portion of development, brain development in particular, in this case, was occurring at that time, it's not a clean mathematical formula, right? It's a very complex, for those of you who might be researchers out there, it's a very complex thing to study, because we're talking about some of those really tough things to study, like fetus, pregnancy, children. We're looking at mothers that are pregnant. There's a lot of complexity around things like your IRB and your ethics around studying these things very specifically, because obviously we are not going to dose fetuses with alcohol to get our information. So there's a lot of, I think Dr. Nia from the University of Hawaii is on here. We've got a lot of folks that are doing studies with rats and with zebrafish and with different things. So there's a lot of publications, and some I'll share at the end, on how we're coming to our information about the brain-based effects. So if your, for example, basal ganglia is affected, and you have just issues like going from one thing to the next thing, and you're a 3-year-old, and your mom says, go brush your teeth and put on your pajamas and go to your bed. You maybe start brushing your teeth and you've already kind of forgotten where we're going to go to bed, right? And so we're going to become that kid that doesn't listen. We're going to become that kid that doesn't follow directions. There's any number of ways that the behavior associated with these damaged parts of the brain might be interpreted. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we go into the specifics of the behavior presentations. But I want folks to know that I will send out these slides, and so you will have access to this. This is one of my favorite slides ever. I just think it's really great for us to understand how the different parts of the brain might be affected and then what the behavior might look like. So brain-based behavior, it's kind of everything. And I think a lot of times in our medical systems, in our health systems, we forget about the brain, and we forget that it's pretty much in charge of everything. And not everything, but we have other systems that are a little more automatic. But we are pretty much dependent on our brain, on the functioning of our brain, to work in a way that allows us to behave in the way that we're expected to behave. And so if there's something going on with our brain, we might not be able to behave in the way that we're expected to behave, and nobody might know why. So the NIH actually says the brain is the source of all the qualities that define our humanity, and we really don't spend a lot of time on figuring out what's going on with our brains societally, systemically, in community, in terms of how we interpret behavior. So I just want us to hold that piece that there might be something invisible going on. I'm going to pause here again for any comments or questions if there's anything coming up in the chat with folks.
Nothing in the chat right now, Amanda, that I'm seeing. But again, giving it a shout out to folks. If they have any questions or comments that they want to share to Amanda throughout the presentation, please drop them in the chat in the Q&A. But I think you're good right now, Amanda.
Thank you. I want to remind everybody, because I know you're not on camera, I can't see you, I don't know what's going on with folks. If you're with me, if you're hanging out, if you're taking all of this information and you're finding yourself kind of going, what, that's normal. That's very much so what happens with a lot of this information that we learn, I think can start to contradict or counteract, just like the person that shared their experience with doc recommending that alcohol was still safe during pregnancy, that there's a lot of things that kind of come up for us and they might be kind of floating around. And I would encourage you right now to either put something in the chat with a question or to kind of let them go for a minute and stay with me, because I know this can be a lot. I'm doing like a fire hose version of this training. It can be anywhere. I got a hair blowing away. It can be anywhere to 3 hours sometimes when I might get all this information in all at once. And so I just want to remind folks to take care of yourself, recognize that you might be learning some things for the first time, and those things might even be contradicting some things that you may have learned or known about prior in your work, especially if you're doing work in behavioral mental health and you're doing work in direct clinical care or work in the community with people who have things like disabilities or mental illness. And so just kind of hang out with me. Remember that we're learning together. We're part of a community of helpers. And I'm going to come back to the brain. All behavior has to do with the brain. Brains are really complicated. How they come to be nourished and put together. So I've been in infant mental health for a really long time. I work a lot with perinatal substance use disorder and babies that have had a lot of stress coming into the world. And I know that resilience is real, and the way in which we do a lot of our nurture can combat a lot of that nature. When I say things like the damage is permanent, that is again, that's mostly correct for our nerdy neuroscience folks who know that we have great neuroplasticity and we can train our brains with really intensive interventions as we get older. It's not to say that there's no hope and that people can't grow and change, but what I want us to imagine is that when we think about brain-based behavior, and if we think about that as being static. If we think about that as being something that is going to be a baseline, we need to be able to change things like interpretation, change things like environments, change things like expectations, to be strength-based, to set people up for success. And I think the disability community is really familiar with that. But when we have something that is invisible or more challenging to diagnose or get a clear picture, we have a lot of responsibility in the care community, in the healthcare community, in education, across our systems of care that are looking at working with people in any way, could be any way. We have a big responsibility to reinterpret some of our sense of meaning. So the meaning of behavior, right? So if our initial perception is that someone is aggressive and we reinterpret that to they're under or overstimulated, it changes the way that we, and I say we as like the royal we, a teacher, a doctor, a parent, a care coordinator, whoever you are in that person's life, we respond to the behavior. If we understand it differently, then we respond differently. And so if we think someone's resistant or they don't care or they're not engaged, maybe we consider that they don't fully understand what's going on. We have to change the way that we provide directions. We have to accept that a daily reminder might be a daily reminder, and that's okay, right? If someone is coping with some memory deficits and then it feels like they're lying, they're not good reporters, accurate reporters, it may be they sincerely can't remember what they saw, what they did, what they said. And that may be an issue with the brain and memory, and not necessarily a desire to hide or conflate. And so when we interpret what is going on with someone differently, we have an opportunity to set that person up for success, even if we're just coming from an informed care lens. Right? Maybe we don't have a diagnosis. We don't know anything. We don't know anything about maternal history. That's not what our job is. But we're experiencing some of these behaviors. Kind of aggressive. Oh, they don't try. They're not very interested, or they're just defiant, right? They're oppositional. They don't want to be involved. If we reframe won't to can't, then we can change environments, we can change expectations, and we can set folks up for success from a brain-based perspective. And this is with or without diagnosis, friends. This is a little bit, in my opinion, this is a little bit trauma-informed. This is just a neurodiversity-informed. I'm coming at it from the lens of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and what happens to the brain and body with prenatal alcohol exposure. But there's something here that's really beautiful about the general understanding, our general understanding of the meaning of behavior and the way that we interpret it to support people in our work. Now try to imagine, as I go to the next slide, try to imagine that you're the person whose behavior is constantly being misunderstood. So you're 2 years old and you're the little one getting in trouble. You don't follow directions. You don't stay in line. You're 5 years old and you can't sit with the worksheet and you're not able to remember what the teacher told you to do next. You're 13 years old and you're not able to get along with, other people. You get in a lot of conflict. Maybe you got some sensory issues, so you don't like to be around people in crowds, and, middle schools are really crowded. So you're someone whose behavior is consistently being misinterpreted as being willful, as being won't. So we're going to talk about stress. When we are misunderstood, when we are constantly being misinterpreted about who we are and why we make the decisions that we do and why we behave the way that we do, we're going to add stress. So I gave you the lovely picture of the brain beforehand in relationship to how alcohol might have might have affected those different parts of the brain. And now we're going to add stress. So when we add the stress from all the misinterpretation about the brain-based behavior, we're going to get into a really, really crazy state in terms of the way that we're interacting with the world. So what I saw for many, many years as a clinician, because I worked first with little kids. I was a preschool teacher many, many years ago. I worked with little kids who were having, behavioral issues and why are they doing these things? And then moving into working with adolescents, to folks that were having severe mental illness. And my career path took me to all sorts of people. But when I looked at the basis or the start of what it might have been going on with somebody, and then all of the ways in which what had happened to them was then misinterpreted in our communities and by their families or by their systems of care. And then you add that stress of being misinterpreted, you're in a combination of a state of chronic stress. And I'm going to make the assumption, okay, that I don't have to do a little stress response exercise here with folks, and that those of you that are coming to this training, please let me know if I'm incorrect, that those of you that are coming to this training have some sense of a basic stress response, fight or flight. In this case, I like to use wizard brain and lizard brain in terms of the parts of the brains that we're using when we're experiencing stress. And so what it is we do very often is that we have a baseline of a brain-based dysfunction because of prenatal alcohol exposure in this case. And then we have lots and lots of misinterpretation and lots of responses that are not necessarily appropriate or helpful. And so we have a state of chronic stress. So people used to ask me, how do you know it's their FASD and it's not something else? What I say is, unless we address the FASD, it doesn't matter what else it is, because that's the baseline. That's what they were born with from baby time, right? This is what they were born with. And so we have to come back to understanding the brain further before we can start to fully interpret behavior. This is my magical dream, you guys. I'm not going to go into it too much more, but my magical dream, because I worked in, for example, domestic violence for a long time, and I had women who had traumatic brain injuries who couldn't get access to things like a functional MRI or brain mapping, where I knew there was a traumatic brain injury. Didn't know where, didn't know how it was affecting behavior. But I was expected to do things like rehabilitation or cognitive behavioral therapies without understanding where somebody's brain was. And I admit, as a clinician, it kind of drove me nuts. I was like, how am I supposed to do these interventions when I don't know what's going on with someone's brain? And that was a part of what led me into FASD work in particular. The power that we do have, even though maybe all of our medical systems are not going to immediately cover things like functional MRIs or brain assessments, neuropsych assessments for everybody, is the ability to reframe. Coming back to what we were initially talking about in terms of our own way of understanding what's going on, is we have a great ability to reframe what we think is going on with someone in the way that we're interacting with them. So if somebody has a memory deficit, we're just going to slow down. We're going to slow down. We're going to repeat. We're going to remind again. It's okay. I think of sometimes it might not be this severe for folks, but that movie 50 First Dates. And Adam Sandler does the whole thing for Drew Barrymore, where he writes her all the Post-its and he gives her all the videos so that every morning she can remember where they are. It's okay. He accepted she was who she was, and it was okay. He wasn't getting upset that she didn't remember every day. And so if we can reframe and say, hey, it's a memory issue, I got to remind them every day, and that's okay. When I think about little guys, I think about my son and how he used to lose his water bottle every single year. I was like, why do I bother to buy a water bottle? I'm not really sure why I bothered to buy a water. It's going to be gone first week of school. The water bottle is going to disappear. When I accepted that I might have to remind him at the end of every day when he got picked up, it started all the way back in first grade, to go check for his water bottle, we got him in a better habit and he stopped losing the water bottle. That wasn't until like sixth grade. But I accepted that I was going to have to keep reminding. And so changing, again, our reframing and the way that we respond, as opposed to us getting angry that the water bottle was always lost. Took me a long time to learn that. That was a long learning curve for Mama too. Giving one direction at a time, writing things down, being literal, if you damage to the parts of your brain that help you understand abstraction or abstract thinking or metaphors. An example a trainer we worked with gave was the idea of raining cats and dogs. and he had a young person that got really excited because they were looking for all of the cats and dogs. Being literal can be very helpful when giving directions to someone who has damage to that part of the brain. And so if we're too caught up in being metaphorical or in giving parallels, that's really helpful for some people. But if we recognize that someone needs to be a little bit more literal, maybe they're a little bit more like 1, 2, 3 is 1, 2, 3, then we need to accept that metaphor or idiom might actually be harmful in terms of them understanding what's going on. Attention, 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 attention. Double checking, asking again. It's okay. Having them get back to you and reiterate what it is that you said and what they understand about what you said, and then doing it again. That's okay. Again, we don't know which parts. We may have issues with memories, direction, and attention and self-control and all these things, and they may be intersecting at any number of places. Providing specific tools, and then again, visual cues, things that allow people to take breaks, a place to go, a place where they can, regulate their central nervous system. Those kinds of things are great for all of us, me, you, and everybody. That's not just for folks who have, specific conditions. Social skills, a really big one is trusted people. What we see very often in youth and young adults who have FASDs is that they're very trusting. So we'll talk more about that when we talk about strengths. They're very trusting, and so they tend to get in trouble because they trust people who they haven't determined are trustworthy. So we see a lot of these folks in our youth programs. We see them committing those smaller crimes, those repetitive misdemeanor crimes. They get in trouble a lot because, again, it's hard to go back and forth with cause and effect. And it's also this innate sense of trusting people too quickly without having a sense of whether or not they're safe. So giving people 5 safe people, helping them label them on their hand. Is this one of my 5 safe people? Am I going to do what they're asking me to do? Oh, they're not one of my 5 safe people. I'm going to say no. There's some basic things that you can use in relationship to helping people to develop safer social skills. I'm being really fast here, friends. Again, I'm squishing what is like a lot of information into a pretty short amount of time. And so I realize I'm going fast. I hope that everybody is vigorously taking notes and very excited to learn all these things. If not, I'll send you the slides. Don't worry about it. There's a lot of opportunity to iterate and learn more from what's in here. We're doing a really big picture overview today. So if I'm going quickly and you're not recalling or you don't get it down, we can get you some more information later. You can inquire with us. So again, let go of any anxiety about learning a whole bunch of new things and drinking through the fire hose about all this stuff right now, and just kind of take in what you can and let go of the things that you might be missing. This is kind of a 101 and an introduction. So I'm just going to keep going, but it's okay if you're not fully tracking everything that I'm putting out right now. Mental health. Teaching self-advocacy was one of the most important things that I felt like we needed to do with adults that had been diagnosed late with FASDs, is that they needed to know what to ask for. So they needed to know some of these things in the above, columns there. Hey, I have a memory issue and I need this. Hey, I need you to write that down, and then I need you to tell me again tomorrow, right? I need a space to go to use my tools, because I'm going to get really overwhelmed really quickly, and my sensory issues are going to make it so I can't be in this room anymore. Helping people to understand what they need, to express and ask for what they need, is one of the biggest self-advocacy things that we can do for folks. While our systems are still figuring out how to deal with this, that individual self-advocacy with anybody that you might know on a spectrum of neurodiversity that isn't getting what they need in terms of our systems, anybody who you may suspect might have some symptoms of an FASD, teaching them to know about who they are, what they need, and to ask for them can be one of the most upstream protective factor ways of helping somebody to get away from that complex lifetime comorbidity issue when we do not have a clear diagnostic path. So just remember, when you start to get to know somebody and what they're about and what they need, Help them to advocate for themselves. Get it written down, get their asks out there to all the different systems of care that they might be in. Get it consistent with their teacher, with their doctor, with their case manager, with their parents. A few consistent and regular things can be so, so helpful. And it can change the trajectory of someone's life for them to have a sense of who they are and what they need. ADLs, I apologize for using acronyms. I know we're not supposed to do that. That's activities of daily living. For those of you who are not familiar with that term, some of the basic stuff, right? Get a watch, use a timer, make a list, create visual cues, practice, practice, practice. These are just a few very small list of the things that we can do that we can feel very powerful right now in terms of what it means to be FASD informed, to be brain informed, to be brain-based behavior informed, even friends to be trauma informed, because very often we don't know exactly what's going on with the person that's in front of us. And so there are a lot of little tricks and tips here on this list. I'm going to leave this here for a minute. Again, the slides are going to go out to you. We are going to move into talking about our systems of care in Hawaii, but I'm going to take a pause right now and see where we are at in the chat or if we have any comments or questions.
Thanks, Amanda. A question actually did pop up, if I could pose it to you right now. How do you open a conversation for someone who is addicted to consuming these substances without blaming or shaming them for their behavior?
And so it really depends on what your role is. I wouldn't know specifically if this is your brother or your parent or your friend, if this is someone who you're working with in a professional setting. That would depend on the way that you would start to look at that. If we're talking specifically about a personal situation, before you confront anyone directly, I would say do some homework. So get some information, do some little independent study, learn a little bit about brains and behaviors, about addiction, about substance use, about the different types of substances, get a little nerdy because knowledge is power. Having information is really helpful. It allows you to do some of the reframing that I'm talking about in relationship to responding to behavior. It helps you to feel as though you have a sense really of what's going on and then to be present in the situation with some of those reframing skills. Again, I would say, depending on the nature of your relationship with whomever you're talking about, you're going to have a different kind of approach. Obviously, if you're in a professional setting, you should have some of that information. You should have some of that guidance. You should know your role, and you should have a team, hopefully, of people that you can connect with. If you're in a personal setting, I would encourage to get nerdy and then hold that in the back. Hold the nerdiness in the back, but don't try to be the professional with your person that you love or care about. When you love or care about somebody, you're directly related to, their outcomes and what's going on with them is directly affecting you in your life. And so being kind, being passionate, being curious, tell me more about what's going on with you, as opposed to you knowing what's going on or thinking we know what's going on with them and thinking we understand the behaviors. Just being open to receive information that we may not have understood about what's going on. Being, again, that safe person for somebody, I think is really important. Having good quality boundaries in terms of what your role is, right? Family members, we always kind of accidentally become those enablers that we don't mean to be, depending on our situation. We also are the loving, caring, kind, gracious people that should be ever forgiving and ever, loving to the people that are struggling in our life. So getting a little nerdy, knowing what your role is, understanding your boundaries, and being open to receiving information that you don't currently have about what might be going on with that person. Because I think sometimes we think we know, and a lot of times there's focus in the information about why someone may or may not be doing something. So that was super generic. And I don't know the situation or the specifics of that. That's my like a generic general consult because I'm not the clinician or I'm not sure what the specific case is, but I would hope that those are some little tips that kind of can universally apply in those situations.
Awesome. Thanks, Amanda. No other questions or comments have come through the chat, so you're good to go.
All right. Thanks, guys. Everybody kind of shake it out. Take your deep breath, do your stretching, whatever you got to do. Um, I know that this is heavy stuff and it's a lot. And so again, don't beat yourself up if you're falling a little behind, if you're a little sleepy. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I would imagine we're coming off of lunch and we're digesting. Hopefully you got to eat. I know a lot of us don't eat, guilty. A lot of us power through our day. So if you're getting the afternoon sleepies, take care of yourself. Please do your best to stay with me. This is good stuff, but it is hard stuff. So take care of yourself and try to stay present as best as you can. I really would love to like get down on the floor and do some yoga right now. I think I slept a little bit weird, but I am going to stay with you and power through as well. So we're going to transition to talking about our systems. We spent a lot of time in kind of understanding FSD and talking about how we might understand behavior in the presentation, and we're going to get into our systems of care. Again, I'm not 100% sure. Exactly what positions you all have and your backgrounds that you're coming from, but I'm going to try to be as broad as I can, and hopefully there'll be something for you in terms of where you fit. So in Hawaii, we have a law that is Act 182. It was signed by Governor Green in 2023. That indicates that we are meant to have a co-managed system of care for people with an FASD. This co-managed system of care is around the primary care provider. So it's kind of centered around the primary care provider. And any patient who screens positive for an FASD is going to be working with an FASD specialist. It's very interesting for any of you who have done legislative or policy or systems advocacy or in that space. I've been in this space for some time, and I've done a lot of work in different places. This is the first time where I was working with a statute that kind of that had a lot of pukas, that didn't have the meat behind the potatoes of what this meant. So there are two elements in this statute that are really important. One of them, the assumption that we have diagnostic capacity in Hawaii, that we have people that are screening and that we have people that are diagnosing. And the other one is that we have teams of FASD specialists in Hawaii to be a part of this co-managed system of care. Those are the assumptions that are made in Act 192. They are incorrect. And we're going to go a little bit into where our systems currently are. So earlier this year, the FASD Action Group did a statewide survey of providers. We have more than 200 responses around FASD, and we asked some questions about their familiarity with FASD, whether or not they felt like we should be screening, and whether or not they themselves kind of had capacity to do that. And so this is a truncated analysis. I think we have the full analysis on our website, but what we found is that 9 and 10, so 90% of folks felt like it was a serious issue in Hawaii. So they were coming from this place that says, oh yes, FASD is definitely a thing in Hawaii that we need to be looking at. And then 95% of folks said, hey, we got to be screening keiki, right? We got to make sure that we are looking at it when folks are young. We got to get in early. 95% said that was either very important or important, that we got to be screening keiki. And then 2/3 of folks said, ooh, but I don't know how, and I'm not really familiar with any kind of screening tools. So that's more than 75% said, not really sure that. And so when we asked about, are you diagnosing FASDs, we got into 5%, only about 5% of folks said, hey, we're comfortable diagnosing, we're very comfortable screening. Most folks were uncomfortable and did not have training. What I thought and this is just maybe the way that I think, guys, because I've been in this work for a long time where I'm at the point where I've had multi-generational experiences where I've had the baby that I worked with when they were very young become an adult and be still in our system somewhere. And so that's the kind of thing that breaks my heart, that we forget the babies and they are cakey become adults. So I found it a very interesting point in the survey that we did, that even though it was really important to screen cakey, it went down. The total of like important or very important went down to 56%. We're talking about adults. I'm like, where do we think those cakey go? Who do those cakey become? And so I always kind of think in my own mind about multi-generational considerations. If we're maybe not quite getting it right upstream, we still have a responsibility downstream. So when people get older, to address what might be going on with them, especially if it is a condition that they were born with. So why is this? Why is this so hard? How come people are not looking at this? So a lot of stigma, a lot of shame, a lot of lack of awareness, a lot of lack of resources, lack of training. People feel like, well, if I give that diagnosis, then I'm shaming the mom, or if I give that diagnosis, then I'm shaming the kid. A lot of fear and trepidation around this idea of it's this substance usey thing, and it's not something that I usually work in my practice, even if we're talking about, let's say, a mom who's drinking the wine every night, right? And maybe we're going to have some effects as a result if that's regular. And we had clinicians kind of openly admit to us that they're not diagnosing, they are not screening generally and regularly across the lifespan, and that it's a very uncomfortable, kind of stigmatized thing for folks to talk about. So again, what do we end up with then? We end up with a whole bunch of invisible brain neurodevelopmental disorders of folks in our communities. We do not have epidemiological data in Hawaii on the FASD diagnosis, which makes sense because we don't have folks that are diagnosing because it's complicated and stigmatized and they don't feel well prepared and trained. So when we look at the whole system of things, for those with the social work, looking at the micro, meso, and understanding the way those interact with one another, if we don't have folks that are comfortable diagnosing, then we're not going to have folks diagnosed. But what, again, we end up with is a whole bunch of invisible brain-based neurodevelopmental disorders. So I'm going to go back 21 years, and I know we usually don't use data this way, but I'm going to play around with it with you guys. We're going to go back to our 2004 PRAMS data. So PRAMS is the Pregnancy Risk Assessment Monitoring System that we have in Hawaii. It's national. This is our Hawaii data. So this is from 2004. So that means that the folks that were born in 2004 are now 21. And what does it mean when you're 21? We can now be legally drinking alcohol. We know a lot of that occurs before the legal age, but we're just going to go with that for the sake of the example. So our folks that were born in 2004 are now turning 21 this year. And we had in Hawaii 8,300, so 8,300 unattended pregnancies in Hawaii. And so our rate was close to half, 45% on average of unattended pregnancies. Our reported, that's important to remember, reported binge drinking rate, again, safely reporting binge drinking is not always something we're going to get accurate information. So we'd imagine that this is a low, right, in terms of the information. So was hovering during this time, it's a little lower in 2004, or 21-year-olds might be a little less, but hovered between 2004 and 2008 at about 19%. So let's do some math. I don't have my math. Sorry, I skipped my math. But the math is that we're looking at about 15 or 1,600 pregnancies. Excuse me, I don't know where my math went. I got to do the math in my head. That are exposed to alcohol. Now, that's just the binge drinking rate just prior to pregnancy with the unintended. So I may not be exactly, I'm not saying I'm positive, but we're going to go ahead and we're going to put some of that together in relationship to how we might understand prevalence in Hawaii. and that this is going to be a lifelong neurological or neurodevelopmental condition. Okay. We have no data on diagnosis. None. There's a few data points that I found more than 20 years ago on full FAS. That's the full with the facial features. Again, that's a very small percentage. But in Hawaii right now, we do not have information about this. And I'll talk a little bit more about why, but I'm inviting everyone in. There's no shame or blame around the reality that even our systems have really struggled to get a handle on how to address this. What I do want to say, though, is this is some of our direct work. I was the clinical director of family treatment services for a little while, and we in 2024 did a special population screening pilot. And when we looked at the adults, so these are the grown-ups, these are our mamas coming in that are struggling with a perinatal substance use disorder. We had a 76% rate of high risk for an FASD in our adults. Okay, so we did not have a full diagnostic clinic. We can diagnose like a F88 and a DSM for those of you that are nerdy about that in relationship to neurodevelopmental conditions, neurobehavioral conditions. But we had a 76% risk rate. For those of you who are nerdy about epidemiology, that is wild, right? That is absolutely wild when we're talking about risk in a population, even though it was a special population. So we're looking at anywhere between 5 to 7% in the general population and up to 76% and hovering around there. There's some other national studies that indicate we have really high rates in our prisons. We have really high rates in all types of rehabilitation facilities, especially for severe mental illness and substance use disorders. We have really high rates in our folks that are struggling with homelessness and are without housing. And so we know well that FASDs are really disproportionately presented in our already very high risk population. So those of us that are doing more intensive work downstream, right, where we've got folks that are really struggling already with all of that cloud. I don't have my visuals, I use my hands, okay? So we're talking about the brain base and then all of that misunderstanding, that misinterpretation, the lack of diagnosis, the lack of understanding, and then that state of chronic stress that we talked about earlier. We've got big swaths of folks that are coming in with a baseline FASD that is never diagnosed. And it's not diagnosed specifically in Hawaii because we know that we do not have diagnostic capacity. So we have a little bit of like a chicken and eggy situation in relationship to some of our systems. I realize that's a little bit of a off, but I'm gonna go back really quick to talk about some common strengths in folks with FASD because I want us to frame this from a systemic viewpoint in how we respond to people's behaviors. So if somebody has an FASD and you look at the different parts of the brain that might be affected, they might be really friendly or more likable. If you have an issue with memory and you have an issue with cause and effect, you're not going to be very good at holding grudges. You're not going to be somebody that's going to be angry the next day about something that happened. That you might have a very friendly and kind and likable personality. You might be hyperverbal. You actually might have less communication skills depending on the type of damage that occurred from the ethanol. There's a real significant desire to be helpful, to be a part of. Some of that is the comorbidities around generally being excluded because of being different. You have to be really determined. Again, these are not unique necessarily to someone who has an FASD, but when you start to cluster, like we do when we talk about symptoms or diagnostic processes, when you start to cluster some of these things together, you might be starting to get some kind of sense. When you look, for example, adding potential risk, maternal risk, when you look at some of the systems of care someone might have been in, if we're talking about an older child or adolescent or somebody who's an adult. And then you look at some of these ways you experience them from a strength-based perspective, you can start to kind of put some of those things together. And so typically when we are talking about diagnosis, and again, I apologize for jumping around, but some of it is because our systems of care are pretty funky. When we're looking at diagnosis, especially for adults, the folks that are doing well in other states, for example, Washington State University has a great diagnostic clinic that uses a 4-point multi-axis system. There are other places like in Minnesota and on the East Coast where they have diagnostic clinics where they're able to look at folks that are older and start to put together some of these pieces in a way that may or may not include very specific brain-based assessments, like access to things like a functional MRI, but those are not easily accessed in our healthcare systems. We know that, right? So we're looking at a unique development or gathering of history, current presenting symptoms. We're looking at that fuzzy bit that they may have experienced between being born, the complex comorbidities, and that state of chronic stress they might be living in, especially if we're looking at, again, an adolescent or older adult. So we require a multidisciplinary team for the most part for diagnostic, especially past, again, childhood. We have a few, I don't want to name names, but we do have some partners that are diagnosing FAS early in kiddos where we have maternal history. But I will say, and I'll say this sadly and proudly to some degree, that when I was running a therapeutic nursery at Family Treatment Services, where my babies were being born into our program, so we knew we had confirmation of maternal use. Mom was coming to us saying, I'm struggling with alcohol. I've been struggling with alcohol. I've been pregnant and I've been struggling with alcohol. So we had absolute confirmed confirmation of maternal use throughout the pregnancy. I got one NIAAA diagnosis with nearly 1,000 kids. It's, for about that decade. And that was at a specialty clinic that we do have here. But that was a battle. And I'll admit now I don't work there anymore. I drove that moment to the clinic. And that was maybe not necessarily, it was my normal scope of practice. But that was what my NIAAA was saying was the right thing at the time. And it was really important for that family. And so I think that when we are imagining what does diagnosis look like, especially as kiddos are getting older, what does screening look like, especially throughout the lifespan, we have to consider the strengths and the experiences that people in their lives or people in their systems of care, feedback from teachers about the way that they were in third grade is information. They really sucked at math, but they were so helpful feeding the fish. They always wanted to feed the fish, and they always were like consistently wanting to help and care for something else. There's these little bits of information that we can start to put together to conceptualize. So I'm gonna kind of just leave that with you because I don't want us to forget that when people who have FASDs get what they need and the focus is strength-based, they can actually do really, really well. And I'll talk more about an adult leadership collaborative that our organization has a relationship with, about the people who have gotten the things that they need, gotten their diagnosis early on in life, or some as adults, and are now doing really well because they have the structured supports that are appropriate for their conditions. In Hawaii, we need screening across the lifespan. This is true for not Hawaii specific. This is true for everyone. We need to be able to look at it all the way from birth to early intervention, to looking at our systems of care in our Department of Education, and looking at our youth services, looking through child welfare services, all of these other even more and more complex services that people might end up in. Again, that baseline brain with that chronic stress and all the mess in between, we're going to see folks in our more complex systems as adults, young adults and adults, that may be at risk not only for all the terrible things, guys. I could read off the horrible statistics today, but I won't. Around things like an increased risk of suicide and an increased risk of overdose and increased risk of isolation, homelessness, all these things. But we're gonna acknowledge that this is something that needs to be looked at throughout the lifespan. So if you work with babies, or if you work with men coming out of prison, which was what I did, I went from babies to men coming out of prison one weekend, Friday to Monday. It's a very same approach in relationship to understanding brain-based behavior and looking at some of these factors that might be involved. We need to build that real co-managed system of care. So right now, Our data is telling us we do not have diagnostic capacity in the state. Right? We do not have any FASD specialists. That's a totally made up thing. I might, at this point, be a self-deemed FASD specialist. I've got some great volunteers on our team. Again, Dr. Nia's here, Darlene, who you'll see at the end. There's a couple of folks, Dr. Ann, who's our founder. There's some great folks that might be at this point considered FASD specialists. We do not have a credential that's associated with that. We did not have a path that allows us to get there. And that is something that we need to work on within our systems. And hopefully the action group can be supportive of that, to look at what does it mean to develop this real co-managed system of care, right? This system of care that says we're going to have docs that are trained, that have access to diagnostic capacity in clinics, and managed systems of care that include multidisciplinary teams and FASD specialists, because we're able to talk about it comfortably. We've recognized it as a societal thing, and we get it integrated across the lifespan. So there are some really specific things that our group is going to be working on since we passed the FASD Respect Act, and we may be looking at some opportunities to pair with both federal regulatory statutes as well as some funding to expand what it is we're doing in terms of understanding this, to look at more specific types of care, maybe eligibility criteria, cleaner diagnostic criteria, looking at our developmental disabilities folks, the Department of Education, our early intervention. It's everybody. It's a Kākau thing, friends. And so this is why we say that it's a Kākau thing. I hope that nobody works for the Department of Health. Friends at the Department of Health have been very transparent about recognizing how challenging this is. We used to have a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder coordinator for this state. That was all the way up until, I believe, 2013. There was a couple of years of funding, but it got challenging because the Kākau element became very heavy to this one particular position in this one particular department. And it's all of us. It's everybody. It should be spanned out and spread out. When you're talking about a position or a person, and you're talking about up to 7% of the general population, we need to look at the way that we approach and the way that we understand what it is we're really talking about. Because there are people that are saying, well, if we diagnose everybody, it's going to overwhelm this system. Or if we have everybody in this system, it's going to overwhelm this system. What we're talking about, friends, is transformation. We're talking about making it safe to talk about, but what if I did? So in our public awareness campaigning, we do try to avoid 100% preventable, because that implies, again, bad maternal behavior. And like our friend earlier, I apologize, I can't see your name, shared, this is a systemic issue. This is not a one-to-one bad mom issue. We try to imagery or implications around maternal behavior. We try to talk about it from the perspective that says alcohol is here, it's legal, it's everybody. We're going to try to do education about prevention, but we're also going to acknowledge, but what if I did? But what if I did? And then what is my child or my children going to need in our systems of care to succeed, to thrive, to be FASD informed and get them a strength-based way of knowing? And that needs to be a Kākau thing. That cannot just be on our Department of Health. That cannot just be on a Department of Education. That has to be a community-based, co-managed system of care that helps everybody to know, hey, we're going to catch this early. We're going to do all that great neuroplasticity stuff sooner. We're going to get people understanding behavior sooner. We're going to avoid that ugly complex comorbidity that gets people into those systems of care where they're really misunderstood and often mistreated. And we're going to be able to talk about this in a way that is compassionate, that is curious, that is from a community and collective standpoint. alcohol is here, guys, and we all have a responsibility. We all have some sort of piece in this. Again, the likelihood is that we all know somebody as well. And so I really want us to kind of commit to learning more together. If I fire hosed you, I apologize, but that's the reality of the complexity of this public health issue, is that it goes everywhere, it touches everything, and we need to stop insisting that it's rare. It's not rare, it's everywhere. Thank you, FASD United, for that wonderful tagline. But let's commit to learning together. So I'm going to give you a few resources that are some of my favorite because we're still growing this movement in Hawaii. There is an online screening tool, and Dr. Matson, the one who gave me the lovely slide of the brain, is, I believe at this point, I think I double checked recently, still actively running that. So if you're working with an adult client or you're working with somebody or you have somebody in your family, you can actually go online and take this screener. It's about 45 minutes, and you can request your results, print them out, take them right to your doctor. And if your doctor says, I don't know what's going on, I don't have diagnostic capacity, I don't know what to do with this, that's when you can come to us, the advocacy group, and we can go back and start to work with our friends, for example, at Medicaid or in our health plans, and to work on that co-managed system of care and the Kākau thing, and look at developing our screening and diagnostic capacities further. So everybody's a part of this in relationship to kind of pushing the needle about how we put this together. I love a lot of what's going on in other countries. This is just my preference. I wish we had universal health care. I wish we were coming from a socialist vantage point about healthcare. I just outed myself in that sense, but I'm not ashamed. And so I love what is being done in the UK. Specifically, this is information from Scotland. The ALC Changemakers, the Adult Leadership Collaborative. This is a group of adults that either had diagnosis early or maybe even later on in their life that is self-advocating. They have done some beautiful research about their own conditions. There's a lovely story that Emily Hargrove shares about being in a room with other folks that have FASDs and starting to talk to each other and recognizing they had all these health conditions that were similar or common amongst them. And it started a lovely kind of screening research project that was quite large that they eventually published about the complex comorbidities that come with a full body condition that is an FAS or an FASD. And so they are adults with FASD thriving, living their lives with the right kinds of supports for the conditions that they have. FASD Institute is a really cool org. I believe they're based out of British Columbia, Canada, and they do a lot of really culturally based supports for folks with FASD. And so there's, obviously in Hawaii, we're working on our own unique ways of approaching this, and including FASD as a Kākau thing, but they're kind of a model that we're looking at in relationship to being culturally based about how these things are approached. FMF Connect is a phone app for families with kids that have FASTs. I believe that is beyond, it used to be in like beta, and I think they actually are working now, and I think they've got it on both the Apple and Google platforms. FASD United is the org that I was talking about. They're our national affiliate. They have a family navigator program. We are kind of we know that right now, to be honest, when they do the Family Navigator, if you go to the United one, they're going to send it back to us. And so in that sense, we're trying to create that demand to help everybody, develop a larger system of care. What I would say as we're coming to time and we're finishing up here, I just tell everybody that, so if you're learning anything new today, if you're even just one or two things, right, are really sticking out, alcohol is worse than a lot of the other substances in pregnancy. 1 in 7 pregnancies is affected by alcohol. 1 in 20 or maybe closer to 18 people have an FASD. There's a lot of things for us to share with just our friends, just in casual conversation. That's a part of this movement, and part of what we're doing is this a Kākau thing. So hopefully you can take away even just little bits and feel empowered to be a part of what we're doing here to look at this. So we can all make that difference. We need to check our biases. We need to be aware of that reframe in the way we understand behavior. Go back to those slides, reframe that, reframe that, reframe that. What does that mean? What does that mean? Are we screening at any of the junctures where we're working? When and why and how are we screening? Again, I know that we're kind of not, guys. We're at the beginning of this, but asking those questions. Ask, hey, do we screen for FASD? Hey, do we have an FASD screener? Hey, is that something that we consider in our screenings? Hey, when we do our intake, do we ask about FASD? These are wonderful, wonderful questions that you all could be putting out into the ether to help, again, this movement. I want to remind you that I do a good job of sounding fancy sometimes, but I am the only employee. I'm sitting here in my little brother's bedroom in my mom's house. That is where I work, and that is my office for the most part. I do have a small office at Nimitz, but this is my office. I mostly work out of my car. And so this is the beginning of a movement. I have fabulous and fabulous, wonderful volunteers. Again, I think Dr. Nia is on here. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Darlene. Dr. Ann is our founder, and she's so in community. We have beautiful, beautiful, wonderful volunteers. But right now we are a tiny, tiny organization looking at a very, very big public health issue that, again, has prevalence that I don't even think we're really getting at. Epidemiologically is huge. And right now the movement is coming out of my little brother's bedroom. And so I want, he's almost 40, he doesn't live here anymore. I want everybody to understand that this is a Kākau thing and you are a part of it. So your curious questions, your kindness, your compassion, your reframing, you're getting in the mess, you're asking, that's all a part of being, in this movement and making it a true Kākau thing. I'm going to give you another opportunity to get involved. I'm going to share a little bit more about some of what we're doing. But first, because I always forget this, I'm going to make you do the survey. So pretty please, if you're able to bust out your phone and get to this, it's a really, really quick, it's like 3 questions. You don't even have to put your email if you don't want to. It just is helping us to demonstrate that the work that we're doing in Hawaii, that the work that we're doing, because we did get funding through Act 192, is making a difference in increasing awareness, of helping people to understand, to reframe, to be a part of this greater movement that is a Kākau thing that is helping everybody to move forward in a different way, including our systems of care. And we're kind to our department heads and our docs and our folks that are in administration and doing great work in legislation, because we recognize how complicated this is, how hard it is, and how unique of a public health issue this is. So if everybody can get out their phones and go ahead and do that survey, I will send this out again. I'll send this out to Melia and to Maka, and to make sure that we have a little bit of follow-up around that. I am going to go to the next slide because I know I'm coming to time. So if you didn't get a chance to scan that, we'll go back. But FASD Awareness Month is this month, you guys. It's so beautiful that we got the opportunity to do this training at this time. But our lovely fake Hurricane Kiki allowed us to move our with getting permits really quick, turn around really quick because we thought there was going to be a hurricane. Move our FASD Awareness Month at the state capitol to the 30th. So it hasn't happened yet. And now you all can come. And so the QR code that is on that, I believe on the bottom right side, will let you sign up. And I think you can sign up to get a t-shirt. I think we still got some left. But please, please join us. We are starting some sign waving at 8 a.m. I know that's early, but that's partially because it gets really hot if you don't do that sooner. So we are doing some sign waving because visibility, friends, visibility is our first step. We are talking about hundreds, if not thousands of people in our community that have an invisible neurodevelopmental disorder that they are really struggling with. And so making it okay to talk about, getting it away from that shame stuff, and talking about it in community as a Kākau thing helps to make it visible. I want to point out, because I always got to shout out Darlene Chenskova on the middle of that picture right there. She is our tireless legislative advocate that worked so hard to help us to pass Act 192, as well as our FASD Awareness Month bill that was sponsored by Rep. Amato. And I have to shout out Senator San Buenaventura and the folks that have been supportive of the legislation that has been going on in Hawaii. But visibility, visibility, visibility. We are going to have our communications people are going to come and do B-roll, and we're going to have some coverage with our local media. Get on your Instagram. I don't know how to do the Instagram. My assistant helps with that. But if you go to fasdhawaii.org, the pop-up for the sign up for the 30th should come up. I think if you scan the little thingy, it'll go to our link tree and you can sign up if you want a t-shirt, if you want to come on the 30th and get a t-shirt. Please join us, friends. This is a movement that we all have a responsibility to be involved in because it is a Kākau thing. Thank you so much for your time. I apologize. I did not leave too much time for questions. I have a full reference slide here, and we will send this out to folks. I'm going to go back to the survey if folks need to get that done. But mahalo. I will pause now. We got a minute or so if folks have any questions left in that chat.
Thank you, Amanda. What a wonderful presentation. But yeah, I think you had questions. I don't see anything coming in through the chat and the Q&A. I also want to honor folks' time that has joined us. So I want to mahalo Amanda for what a wonderful presentation you offered. I felt like I learned so much in this short amount of time, but it also scratched my interest to learn more after this. So I want to say mahalo to you for sparking that interest. Thank you again to folks that are joining the call. We will have this QR code available. I will make sure to populate that into the mahalo email that Melia will follow. That will send out shortly after this webinar. For those that are jumping on, mahalo. Yeah, I just want to echo fabulous presentation. So much wonderful information. Mahalo nui. All kudos to you, Amanda, for such a lovely and informative presentation that you offered us. Actually, we do have a question that come. Oh, somebody just said mahalo nui loa. We just want to give you the kudos and the flowers that you so wonderfully deserve, and also those that are part of your volunteer group and doing all of the amazing work in spreading the awareness. So yes, folks, we will make sure to share all of this, all her resources and the reference sheets, and as well as the promotion to join us, to join them at the Capitol for your sign waving next week. What is that, Tuesday, the 30th?
Yep.
I will make sure we all can do our best to spread the word. So mahalo nui to everybody. Have a great rest of your day, and we will be in touch. Thank you all.
Aloha, friends.
Mahalo.